Upper Echelon is brought to you by Deloitte. For innovative thinking and thorough strategic planning, turn to Deloitte. In studio today is Kevin Wakeford, probably best known for his affiliation with SABEC, SACOP, in the late 90s and early 2000s. Very controversially resigned from SACOP following a letter to Thabo Mbeki alleging that Sasol and Deutsche Bank manipulated the value of the rand. It's virtually a decade later. Looking back, was that a turning point in your life?
Someone said to me recently, Rick, that it was a defining moment, and often one's life is defined by a moment. So some people still speak about me as the Rand guy or the Rand man, and they've forgotten my name, but they remember that moment in my life. Yeah, I remember it very, very well to this day. I haven't forgotten any of the key elements of it. But I think it was, in life you are confronted with moments where you have to make a decision. And I'd received that information. And the information wasn't comprehensive, but it certainly pointed to skullduggery in the markets. I then made that information available to the then president of the country, and he acted on that. My view is that the commission itself was a lame duck. It was closed down too quickly. It looked into the case studies that I'd presented. It didn't look too much broader than that, in my view. And if it had, I believe a lot more would have come out. And I think the fact that the rand at that time had gone to 13.85 to the dollar and 20 rand to the pound, and it had lost value at around 9% per annum for 15 years prior to that. And since then, it has gained ground. It went all the way to around 550. And is sitting now where it was 10 years ago. And I'm quite happy that that, in a sense, has vindicated what I did at the time. It illuminated the markets, and I think when there's illumination and light, darkness recedes, and a lot of the skullduggery stopped then. I'm not saying it stopped completely. It'll always be there in the markets. You're going to have your foxes in the marketplace, as Clem Santa calls them, but they're there. And if I look back, I would do exactly the same thing. I don't think I would have done anything differently. I possibly would have been less naive, and perhaps a little bit more, as we say in Afrikaans, vastberade. And I would have been far more aggressive in taking on some of those issues. For instance, when the commission closed, perhaps it should have been challenged in a court of law in this country. And the findings, particularly the minority report, which pointed to the need for prosecution and further investigation, I think perhaps it would have been more prudent of me then to institute some kind of class action against those who had shut it down for whatever reason they had.
But subsequently, did it influence your career? Did you get a negative perception from how people treated you?
I had a number of very, very tough years. I think there were a lot of people who sympathized with me, a lot of people who identified with what had happened. But the character and nature of the business realm is that, you stay away from anything that's perceived as controversial. So I went through about 2 or 3 years of where, I literally sold properties that I owned and traded in a vehicle on a cheaper one. And, I got back to some really earthly living, but that was good. It was very good for me at the time. And the last 10 years, I can see that I've gone through a number of processes. I've advised a premier on economic matters in the Eastern Cape. I've tried to set right an institution in the Eastern Cape called the Eastern Cape Development Corporation, which was going through very trying times at the time. And that in itself was an exploration for me of ups and downs. I've advised a national minister, the National Minister of Home Affairs, on the national turnaround of that department as project advisor.
Which was very successful.
I think it was for me, it was a huge learning curve. We met teams that had worked on Homeland Security in the US, on the Netherlands Department of Internal Affairs, the Belgian Department of Home Affairs. They had also gone through their own challenges and turnarounds, and we drew on those international experiences. We had people out from Brazil, India, a comprehensive indigenous and foreign team. And I think, you know, the work that Fever Tree did at that time speaks for itself. You know, there's been a clean audit coming out of that department. You know, you get your ID book instead of 180 days, you get it in 40 days. You get your passport in 26 days. You get your work permits quicker. It's now a functional department, still with challenges, I believe, but working far better than it did. And I think it's a testimony to what can be done in other departments around service delivery in South Africa.
I just want to go back. You are a person, you were born in Port Elizabeth. You come from an average background. Just take us through, how did you get to university?
Well, firstly, my folks got divorced when I was 2 years old. My mom had to work. I had to go to boarding school at a very young age in 1969. I think I was around 5, turning 6. Went through boarding school throughout my career. At times I was, boarding school teaches you to share, teaches you to be accountable. It also teaches you to stand your ground if you need to. So I had some rough and tumbles. I became rebellious at certain stages of my early teenage years. And then eventually I was called up for national service. I went into the infantry. I was called up into Grahamstown, then went to Oudtshoorn on JLs, as they called them, junior leaders, became a 1-pip lieutenant, trained troops, went to the border, came back. Then I couldn't afford to go and study, so I became a surgical rep for 18 months, saved up, and then went to study at the University of Port Elizabeth and majored in politics, public administration, anthropology, and of course in my honours year focused in on political economics. And then ended up after that.
But you did very well. You got university colours for that, for academic performance.
I managed to get a BA cum laude, and then BA honours cum laude, and then academic colours awarded for both degrees. Then,
but just you were also at university, very involved with IDASA and. Reportedly against, you were an activist against the apartheid government at that stage. How did you, get that insight? How did you become so involved in that those activities?
Yeah, look, I wouldn't say I was a typical political activist. I think by virtue of being drawn into IDASA as a part-time coordinator, at the time it was headed up by Van Zyl Slabbert, a great man of intellect, who was trying to engender a debate around non-racialism versus racism and versus multiracialism. And I think a lot of people fail to make the distinction between, in particular nowadays, between non-racialism and multiracialism. And when you get into that process, you become sensitized and perhaps even conscientized, because you meet people from the political underground, you meet people from the liberation movements. In the Eastern Cape, one obviously would have come across white activists, the Watson family, Cheeky Watson. He was involved in trying to de-racialize rugby, playing in the townships, getting arrested. So it was a time of great learning for me, and discovering that perhaps, we aren't, we don't hold the cudgels of truth. Truth is, your truth might be different to my truth. And when you meet people, particularly in the townships, you discover that there's humanity that is way beyond yours, in terms of sharing, in terms of sacrificing for each other. And that had a huge impact on my life. And at times, as a student, I became fairly vocal. We started the Concerned Students movement. We weren't allowed to start a New SAS branch in those days. It was banned at UPE. So we started the Concerned Students group, and it was fairly vocal, but we did a lot of outside work as well, in underprivileged areas. So we didn't just talk the talk, we walked the walk. And IDASA it was a great experience in just meeting people with headspace way beyond mine at that time.
Later, you showed your entrepreneurial skills you were very involved in setting up the first micro-lending, industry in South Africa. Tell us about that.
Yeah, that was an NGO, Section 21 company called the Group Credit Company. It was run by a very, very active lady by the name of Christine Glover, who also came out of the NGO sector and who understood the Western Cape townships, Khayelitsha, places like that. And the idea was based on the Grameen Bank model at the time. And lending was fostered amongst savings groups. In Xhosa, they call them umgalelos. They were groups usually of women, usually entrepreneurs who didn't have formal jobs, and they would borrow money to, say the group had 5 people in, they would save for 6 months, they would build up a deposit, and then the first 2 would borrow, 4 months later the next 2, and say 6 months the next 2.
Like a stokvel?
It was a rotating savings club, borrowing club. If a bit smaller than the stokvels. The stokvels were big in those days. I don't know how big they are today, but they were massive. Literally at times 100 people. And what I discovered at the time, the Grameen Bank model was based on a group sociology. It was based on when you're very poor, you borrow and you are accountable to your peers in the group. What I discovered amongst, in particular, the Xhosa people at the time was that they were far more modernized than people in Bangladesh, and they were far more individualistic, and they didn't want to be accountable for let's call it the delinquency in the borrowing markets for others. They were more keen on wanting to be responsible for their own loans. So I then started talking to the trade union movement, to the pension funds, and through that I started what one calls the employer lending schemes. It was partly secured by pension funds for housing purposes, and the employer performed a payroll deduction facility, and the trade unions endorsed the credit criteria and the methodologies used to assess a client. So we didn't use the typical ITC credit informed type material. We would eyeball people, we would meet them in the workplace, and then we would lend to them. And that was so successful that NGO metamorphosized over time into a private entity owned today by Nedbank. I think it's called Cashbank within the Nedbank group. And I also helped the IDT Finance Corporation of the time, which then transformed itself and became very much part of African Bank. Also a very successful company.
That industry surely exploded following that. But you were also involved in the very interesting business of 4x4 tires.
Yes, one of my first commercial jobs after my studies was with Firestone South Africa. I was employed by the then MD who had noticed me in Port Elizabeth. I had a bit of a profile at the time, and Bill Taylor decided to employ me and to put me into the marketing and sales division, heading up the passenger and light truck tire section. And that's where we started sponsoring the 4x4 clubs and really getting the sexy part of the tire sector going.
You were also an excellent columnist for Business Day, amongst other publications. Do you still write the odd article?
I write from time to time, but I've lost the discipline of writing once a week or once every fortnight. I found at the time, you'll remember, I wrote, in fact, I looked the other day, over 100,000 words during those 2 years into columns. And I wrote, for me it was cathartic, because it was after being expelled, in a sense, from SACOB, because I resigned, and I actually had no choice. I had to resign because I'd become a very, very hot potato around business unity and around the commission into the depreciation of the rand. So I got my marching orders and I took them very happily. And then I started writing as part of, I think, a cathartic experience, just venting my frustration and some of my personal beliefs around certain issues. And I think that helped me a lot in not necessarily developing, a stomach ulcer or perhaps a heart attack later.
But you're still very, very involved. You're a consultant to various industries. You serve on a few boards. How do you see it going forward? When do you think you're going to call it quits?
Well, I'm only 50. I've still got at least another 20 years of work ahead of me. I've got a number of silent passions. One is to buy some agricultural land, and I've got to have a great love for indigenous animals, so Nguni cattle and paddy sheep, and perhaps even indigenous goats. I think there is a growth industry there because you don't have to treat them with any form of antibiotic. You dip very rarely, you dose very rarely, and I think it's an industry that we need to harness and grow. But I would do it out of a passion for it. I wouldn't do it full time, and I'd like to perhaps write a book. I'm actually in discussions with someone who would like to write a book about the let's call it the Rand Commission, but it's a broader book, much broader than that, and not just about me, but looking into delinquency in the capital markets. And yes, perhaps invest in some smaller type entities and play a role in all of them. But I'm sitting, I found the board experience in the listed sector in Toronto and very interesting as well. It's at times I think it's a game of ticking the boxes, and I'm not a person who likes ticking the boxes. I like to look behind, look at the motive behind what is happening and why you are making a decision, and can you explain why you're making it.
There seems to be a very big disparity or disconnect between the corporate governance levels of JSE listed companies and other entities in the public sector and even unlisted companies. Do you think that will continue?
Well, I think it's, how do you measure corporate governance, and how do you measure, and I think the measuring stick has become very mechanistic. It's more about, in my view, if one could see a huge growth in independent and family business in this country, it would do far more for the economic well-being of our people than to list another 20 companies on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. That's just a personal view. I think the big ability to employ lies in that sector, and I don't believe enough has been done to really unlock the opportunities in that sector.
That was Kevin Wakeford. Thank you. That was very insightful. Upper Echelon was brought to you by Deloitte. For innovative thinking and thorough strategic planning, turn to Deloitte.